My name is Leah Jennings, and I've been working at Warner Services Co. for exactly 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Not that I'm counting or anything, but when you're a senior financial analyst with a photographic memory for numbers and an unhealthy obsession with Excel spreadsheets, you tend to keep track of these things. Warner Services Co. isn't your typical corporate giant. We're a mid-sized consulting firm that specializes in helping other companies optimize their operational efficiency. Think of us as the Marie Kondo of the business world, except instead of asking if something sparks joy, we ask if it sparks profit. The irony of what happened next isn't lost on me. Our CFO, Benjamin Hartwell, was one of those executives who wore his MBA from Wharton like a badge of honor. He had the kind of confidence that comes from never being wrong, mainly because he surrounded himself with people who were too intimidated to correct him. His corner office overlooked the city, and he had this habit of standing at the window with his hands clasped behind his back, like he was surveying his kingdom. I'd been part of the quarterly audit team for 3 years running. My colleagues often joked that I could spot a discrepancy from 3 spreadsheets away, blindfolded. It wasn't just my job, it was my calling. Numbers didn't lie, people did. And in a world full of creative accounting and wishful thinking, someone had to be the voice of reason. The audit team was small but mighty, myself, 2 other analysts, and a rotating cast of external consultants. We'd spend weeks combing through financial records, operational reports, and compliance documentation. It was meticulous work that required patience, attention to detail, and the ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. The bomb dropped on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in my cubicle, 3 cups of coffee deep into my analysis of the third-quarter procurement reports, when Hartwell's assistant knocked on my partition. "Mr. Hartwell wants to see you in his office," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant this wasn't going to be good news. I saved my work, muscle memory from years of unexpected interruptions, and made my way to the executive floor. Hartwell was standing at his window, naturally, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He didn't turn around when I entered. "Leah," he said, his voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd grown to despise. "I've been reviewing the audit team composition for Q4, and I've decided to make some changes." My stomach dropped. In corporate speak, changes was never good. Changes meant someone was getting fired, demoted, or in my case, apparently sidelined. "We need someone with sharper instincts leading the charge this quarter," he continued, finally turning to face me. That's when I saw it, the smirk. Not just any smirk, but the particular variety that said he was enjoying this moment far too much. "Thompson will be taking over your responsibilities on the audit team." Thompson. Kevin Thompson, the golden boy who'd been hired 6 months ago straight out of some prestigious finance program. He had all the credentials but none of the experience. He could talk a good game in meetings, throwing around buzzwords like synergy and actionable insights, but I'd seen his spreadsheets. They were disasters waiting to happen. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice steady. What I wanted to say was, this is a mistake that will cost you dearly, but I'd learned long ago that challenging Benjamin Hartwell in his own office was career suicide. "I'm sure you do," he replied, that smirk widening. "Your attention to detail is adequate. But we need someone who can see the bigger picture. Someone who understands the strategic implications of our findings." The dismissal was clear. I was being benched, relegated to routine financial analysis while Thompson took over the most critical audit of the year. As I walked back to my desk, I felt that familiar burn of injustice in my chest. But I also felt something else, a cold, calculating calm. Because here's the thing about being a financial analyst with a photographic memory, you remember everything. Every conversation, every warning sign, every red flag that others choose to ignore. The next 3 days were a masterclass in professional restraint. I watched from the sidelines as Thompson assembled his new audit team, bringing in fresh faces and discarding the institutional knowledge that took years to build. He strutted around the office like a peacock, talking about innovative approaches and paradigm shifts in audit methodology. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and focused on my regular work. But here's the thing, when you've been doing financial analysis for as long as I have, you develop what I call peripheral vision. You can't help but notice when numbers don't add up, even when they're not technically your responsibility anymore. And the numbers at Warner Services Co. were definitely not adding up. It started with small things. Procurement contracts that seemed inflated. vendor payments that didn't match the services rendered, travel expenses that defied logic and geography. Individually, these discrepancies might have been explained away as clerical errors or accounting quirks. But when you looked at them collectively, they painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Someone was embezzling money from Warner Services Company. A lot of money. I'd first noticed the pattern 3 weeks ago, while preparing for what I thought would be my final audit. The inconsistencies were subtle, the kind of thing that would slip past a cursory review but would stand out like neon signs to someone who knew what to look for. I'd started compiling a list of questionable transactions, planning to present my findings to the audit team. Then I got benched. Now, sitting at my desk on Wednesday afternoon, I faced an ethical dilemma that would make philosophy professors weep. I had information that could save Warner Services Co. from a potential financial disaster. But I also had a CFO who'd made it crystal clear that my insights weren't valued or wanted. The professional thing to do would be to approach Thompson directly, share my concerns, and let him take the credit for uncovering the fraud. But every time I looked at his smug face, every time I heard him dismiss years of institutional knowledge as outdated thinking, I felt my resolve weaken. I decided to take a different approach. I would document everything, create an ironclad case, and wait. If Thompson and his team were as sharp as Hartwell claimed, they'd spot the discrepancies on their own. If they weren't, well, sometimes the best lessons are learned the hard way. Wednesday evening, I stayed late in the office. The building was mostly empty, just the security guard and a few workaholics like myself. I pulled up the financial records I'd been analyzing and began cross-referencing them with the procurement database, the vendor management system, and the expense reporting platform. What I found made my hands shake. The embezzlement wasn't just happening, it was accelerating. Someone had been siphoning money from Warner Services Co. for at least 18 months, using a sophisticated network of shell companies and fraudulent invoices. The amounts were staggering, nearly $2 million had been stolen, and the theft was increasing in frequency and boldness. More troubling, the pattern suggested that whoever was doing this had intimate knowledge of our internal controls and audit procedures. This wasn't some opportunistic employee stealing petty cash. This was a calculated, long-term operation being carried out by someone with significant access to our financial systems. By Thursday morning, I had compiled a comprehensive report detailing the fraud scheme. 23 pages of evidence, complete with transaction logs, vendor verification records, and a timeline that showed exactly how the money had been diverted. It was bulletproof, the kind of analysis that would make prosecutors salivate and auditors weep with joy. I printed one copy and locked it in my desk drawer. Then I waited. Thursday came and went. Thompson's team was busy conducting interviews and reviewing high-level financial statements, but they showed no signs of detecting the fraud. I watched them work, noting their methodical approach to all the wrong things. They were focusing on compliance issues and procedural audits while missing the forest for the trees. Friday afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I approached Thompson at the coffee machine, trying to look casual. "How's the audit going?" I asked, stirring sugar into my coffee with more force than necessary. "Great," he replied, his voice full of confidence. "We're really revolutionizing the process. Hartwell is impressed with our efficiency." "Finding anything interesting?" He shrugged. "The usual stuff. Some vendor contracts that could be renegotiated, a few expense categories that seem bloated. Nothing major. Nothing major. $2 million in theft, and he called it nothing major." I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Monday morning arrived like a thunderclap. I was reviewing quarterly projections when the unmistakable sound of Benjamin Hartwell's voice echoed through the office. He wasn't just talking, he was shouting, his words carrying that particular pitch that meant someone was about to get fired. "What do you mean you didn't catch this? How is this possible?" I looked up from my computer to see Hartwell storming through the office, his face red with a combination of anger and panic. Thompson was trailing behind him, looking like a deer caught in headlights, clutching a folder that I assumed contained whatever had triggered this meltdown. They disappeared into the conference room, and within minutes, the entire audit team was summoned. Through the glass walls, I could see the meeting unfolding like a silent movie. Hartwell was gesticulating wildly, pointing at documents spread across the table. Thompson was trying to explain something, his hands moving defensively. The other team members sat in stunned silence. That's when I saw it, a woman in a sharp business suit entering the building, followed by two men in equally serious attire. They had that unmistakable look of external auditors, the kind who get called in when internal controls have catastrophically failed. My phone rang. It was Hartwell's assistant. "Mr. Hartwell wants to see you immediately," she said, her voice tight with stress. I saved my work, grabbed my coffee, and walked to the conference room with the measured pace of someone who knew exactly what was coming. When I entered, the silence was deafening. Hartwell was standing at the head of the table, his hands pressed flat against the surface, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Leah," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "We've just discovered that Warner Services Co. has been the victim of significant financial fraud. Nearly $2 million has been embezzled over the past 18 months. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "That's terrible news. The external auditors arrived this morning after receiving an anonymous tip. They've been reviewing our records for the past 3 hours. He paused, his eyes boring into mine. "They found discrepancies that should have been caught months ago." The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming. Thompson was staring at his hands, probably calculating how this would affect his career trajectory. The other team members were looking anywhere but at Hartwell. "Here's what I don't understand," Hartwell continued, his voice rising. "How did a team of external auditors find in 3 hours what our internal audit team missed entirely?" That's when he exploded. "Why didn't you warn us about this?" he screamed, his composure finally cracking. "You've been analyzing these records for months. How did you miss $2 million in theft?" The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I could have pointed out that I'd been removed from the audit team precisely because my instincts weren't sharp enough. I could have mentioned that I'd tried to raise concerns about anomalies in the financial records. I could have pulled out the comprehensive report I'd compiled and dropped it on the table like a legal bomb. Instead, I took a sip of my coffee and said, "I wasn't on the audit team." The silence that followed my response was the kind that makes your ears ring. Hartwell's face went through a fascinating color progression, from red to purple to an alarming shade of gray. Thompson looked like he wanted to disappear into the conference room carpet. "What did you say?" Hartwell whispered. "I said I wasn't on the audit team," I repeated, my voice steady and clear. "You removed me 3 days ago, remember? You said you needed someone with sharper instincts." The external auditors, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, exchanged glances. The lead auditor, a woman with steel gray hair and eyes like a hawk, cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "Are you saying that Ms. Jennings was removed from the audit team just before this quarterly review?" Hartwell's jaw worked silently for a moment. "That's correct. We restructured the team to bring in fresh perspectives." "I see." The auditor made a note on her pad. "And Ms. Jennings, how long had you been part of the audit team prior to this change?" 3 years, I replied. "I've been conducting quarterly audits since 2021. Another note. "And in your previous audits, did you identify any concerns about the financial discrepancies we've uncovered today?" This was the moment. The crossroads where I could either take the high road or watch everything burn. I thought about Hartwell's smirk, about Thompson's arrogant dismissal of institutional knowledge, about the 3 days I'd spent watching them stumble around in the dark while sitting on information that could have prevented this disaster. I had identified some concerning patterns, I said carefully. But I was removed from the team before I could complete my analysis. The lead auditor leaned forward. "What kind of patterns?" I stood up and walked to my desk, retrieving the folder I'd locked away. When I returned to the conference room, I placed it on the table in front of the external auditors. 23 pages of documented discrepancies, cross-referenced with vendor records and expense reports, I said. I compiled this analysis over the past week, after noticing irregularities in the Q3 financial statements. The auditor opened the folder and began scanning the first page. Her eyebrows rose incrementally as she read. "This is comprehensive. When did you complete this analysis?" "Thursday evening." "And you didn't share this with anyone?" I looked directly at Hartwell. "I was told that my instincts weren't sharp enough to be valuable to the audit process." The room erupted. Thompson started protesting that he hadn't been given access to this information. Hartwell began shouting about insubordination and company loyalty. The other team members were talking over each other, trying to distance themselves from the disaster. But the external auditors just kept reading, their expressions growing more serious with each page. Finally, the lead auditor closed the folder and looked up. "Ms. Jennings, this analysis would have detected the fraud scheme before it reached critical levels. If this information had been acted upon when you first identified these patterns, Warner Services Co. could have prevented significant financial losses." The silence that followed was deafening. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Thompson was reassigned to a junior analyst position, his dreams of rapid advancement crushed under the weight of professional incompetence. The other audit team members were given written warnings and mandatory retraining. And Benjamin Hartwell? He was quietly asked to resign, his MBA from Wharton unable to protect him from the consequences of his own arrogance. I was promoted to senior financial analyst and given oversight of the entire audit department. The board of directors personally thanked me for my diligence and integrity, though I noticed they didn't mention the 3 days I'd spent watching the company bleed money while my warnings went unheeded. The embezzlement case was turned over to law enforcement, and within 6 months, they'd arrested the perpetrator, a mid-level manager in procurement who'd been exploiting weaknesses in our vendor verification process. My analysis had provided the roadmap that made prosecution possible. But the most satisfying moment came during my first meeting as the new audit department head. I was standing in what used to be Hartwell's office, looking out at the city through his windows, when Thompson knocked on the door. "Leah," he said, his voice humble in a way I'd never heard before. "I wanted to apologize. I should have listened to your concerns." I turned to face him, remembering his dismissive attitude just weeks earlier. "The thing about sharp instincts, Kevin," I said, "is that they're only valuable if you're willing to act on them." He nodded, accepting the rebuke with grace. I've learned that lesson the hard way. As he left my office, I reflected on the strange turns that professional life can take. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't proving that you're right, it's watching others prove that you were right all along. So here's the thing about being underestimated in the corporate world, it's simultaneously the most frustrating and most powerful position you can occupy. When people dismiss your expertise, they give you the ultimate gift, the element of surprise. I could have prevented Warner Services Co.'s financial disaster. I could have saved jobs, preserved reputations, and protected the company's financial stability. But sometimes, the most important lessons are the ones we learn through consequences rather than warnings. If you're watching this and you're in a similar position, if you're the person with the sharp instincts being told you're not sharp enough, document everything. Stay professional. And when the moment comes, be ready to let your work speak for itself. Because in the end, numbers don't lie. People do. And the truth has a way of surfacing, especially when you're the one who knows where to look for it. Trust your instincts. They're probably sharper than you think.